Chapter 2. Model Boy. Now, Harry, you be good. Martha Ellen Truman. 1. Harry Truman liked to say in later years that he had the happiest childhood imaginable. Grandpa Young took him riding over the countryside in a high-wheeled cart behind a strawberry-roan trotting horse. Grandpa adored him, the boy knew. One summer, every day for a week, they drove 6 miles to the Belton Fair and sat together in the judges' stand, watching the races and eating striped candy. It was the best time a kid ever had. Grandpa was quite a man, a great big man, with a flowing white beard and strong hands. Until Mama gave birth to a 3rd child, the boy's only competition for attention was little Vivian, who still wore his hair in curls. On a day nearly as memorable as those at the Belton Fair, Grandpa and he conspired to give Vivian a haircut, sitting him up in a high chair on the south porch. Mama was furious when she discovered what they had done, but amazingly she said nothing, so unassailable was Grandpa's authority. The porch where the haircut took place overlooked a broad bluegrass pasture with a creek where the boys were allowed to explore on their own, accompanied by a black and tan dog of uncertain ancestry called Tandy and a cat named Bob. Harry would also remember a swing under an old elm close to the house and another swing indoors in the front hall for rainy days. The long porch on the north side of the house made a perfect racetrack for their red express wagon. They went hunting for bird nests and gathered wild strawberries in prairie grass as tall as they. The farm was a wonderful place. These were wonderful days and great adventures. The young land seemed to go on and on. A few miles beyond the immediate farm with its 600 acres was a second farm owned by Grandpa, this with nearly 1,000 acres. There were herds of cattle, saddle horses, draft horses, mules, sheep, hogs, chickens, ducks, and geese. Harry's father presented him with a black Shetland pony and a new saddle. With the pony on a lead, he let the boy ride beside him as he made his rounds. "I became familiar with every sort of animal on the farm," Harry wrote long afterward, "and watched the wheat harvest, the threshing and the corn shucking, mowing and stacking hay, and every evening at supper time heard my father tell a dozen farmhands what to do." It was a time of self-contained security and plenty, such as the Trumans were not to know again. Most marvelous in memory for Harry was the abundance of food: dried apples, peaches, candy and nuts of all kinds, wonderful cookies, pies, corn pudding, roasting ears in summer. There were peach butter, apple butter, grape butter, jellies and preserves, he would write, all produced in a big crowded kitchen by Grandma Young and a German hired girl. Following the late autumn freeze and hog-killing time came homemade sausages, souse, pickled pig's feet, and lard rendered in a tremendous iron kettle said to have been too heavy for old Jim Lane to carry away. From his Aunt Ada, the boy learned to play euchre. Uncle Harry told amusing stories and taught him a card game called coon can, a form of gin rummy then more popular than poker. Though Uncle Harry, the bachelor uncle, had forsaken farming for the bedazzlements of Kansas City, he returned often, bringing candy and toys. Like Grandpa Young, he was a big man, over 6 feet tall, strong as a wrestler, good-humored, handsome, and like Grandpa Young, he made Harry feel he was somebody particular because he was named for him. When he came, it was just like Christmas. The child liked everybody, to judge by his later recollections. Cousin Saul Childs, then in his teens and often surly and difficult, would be remembered as somebody who really made life pleasant. Saul's mother, Aunt Sally, was a lovely person. Aunt Laura, another frequent visitor from Kansas City, was somebody we always enjoyed. Yet life had its troubles and woes. On the summer day when his grandfather Truman died, 3-year-old Harry had rushed to the bed to pull at the old man's beard, trying desperately to wake him. Climbing on a chair sometime afterward in an attempt to comb his hair in front of a mirror, he toppled over backward and broke his collarbone. Another time he would have choked to death on a peach stone had his mother not responded in a flash and decisively, pushing the stone down his throat with her finger instead of trying to pull it out. Later, when Grandpa Young lay sick in bed and the little boy approached cautiously to inquire how he was feeling, the old pioneer, fixing him with a wintry stare, said, "How are you feeling? You're the one I'm worried about." It was Mama, Harry decided, who understood him best. She was brighter than anyone, he thought, and cared most about his well-being. Holding him in her lap while explaining the large print in the family Bible, she taught him to read before he was 5. Then the summer of 1889, following his 5th birthday, Mama surprised him with a baby sister, of whom nothing had been said in advance. From the sound of crying upstairs, he and Vivian thought a new pet had arrived. The baby was named Mary Jane after John Truman's mother, the grandmother they had never known, and to Harry she was a miracle. He adored her. It was Mama, also, a year later, who hustled him off to Kansas City for expensive eyeglasses. Though he had been badly handicapped by poor eyesight all along, blind as a mole, in his words, no one seems to have noticed until the night of a July 4th fireworks when Matt saw him responding more to the sound of the skyrockets than to the spectacle overhead. The Kansas City optometrist diagnosed a rare malformation called flat eyeballs, hypermetropia, which means the boy was farsighted, and Matt agreed to a pair of double-strength wire-rimmed spectacles at a cost of $10. All at once the world was transformed for him as if by magic, and as quickly he became a curiosity, small boys with eyeglasses being almost unknown in rural Missouri. Her heart went out to him, Matt later said, but she was determined not to pamper. While Grandma Young gave every youngster free rein, Mama taught that punishment followed transgression. She had a switch and she would use it. When Harry led Vivian and another child on an expedition to a waterhole in the south pasture to spend a glorious afternoon plastering each other with mud, she punished Harry severely, and Harry alone, for being the ringleader. But more painful by far were Papa's occasional outbursts, for though John Truman never spanked, never laid a hand in anger on any of his children, which seems remarkable for a man of such known temper, his scoldings were enough to burn the hide off. One incident was never forgotten. His father had been leading him on the pony when Harry fell off, only to be told that any boy who could not stay on a pony at a walk must walk himself. Harry cried all the way back to the house, where Mama let it be known she thought he had been unjustly treated. Still more change followed in the summer of 1890, the summer of the eyeglasses, when Mama announced they were leaving the farm, moving to Independence, so that Harry could receive proper schooling. With money inherited from his father, John Truman acquired a house and several lots on South Chrysler Avenue, close to the Missouri Pacific Railroad tracks. At age 40, having attained nothing like the success forecast in the Jackson County history, John had decided to try again as a stock trader. He paid $1,000 down for a house and land and took out a mortgage for $3,000, certain he had driven a good bargain with the owner, Samuel Blitz, one of the few Jews in town. For Harry, whose world through the new eyeglasses had only just come into focus, the next few years were to be a time of great adjustment. In 1892, Solomon Young died at age 77. Less than a year later, a black servant girl trying to light a coal oil lamp accidentally ignited a fire that burned the Young house to the ground. Practically nothing was saved, and though a small house intended as a temporary replacement was put up on the same spot for Grandma Young, and Uncle Harrison returned to help manage things, the old way of life at the home place was over. The one personal possession of Grandpa Young's to survive the disaster was the brass telescope from his days on the plains, which he had given to Matt some time before. 9-year-old Harry's feelings at the time of his grandfather Young's death went unrecorded, but in later years he would talk often of the big man in his background who had made his own way in the world on nerve and will, who had seen the Great West when it was still wild, who played a part in history, and who, of course, came home always to Missouri. With such a grandfather, a boy could hardly imagine himself a nobody. He appears to have liked school from the start. He liked his first-grade teacher, Miss Myra Ewan. He liked his second-grade teacher, Miss Minnie Ward. He liked all his teachers, by his later account. "I do not remember a bad teacher in all my experience," he would reflect, and learned quickly how to make them like him. In this he felt he had quite a knack. He made a study of people, he remembered. "When I was growing up, it occurred to me to watch the people around me, to find out what they thought and what pleased them most. I used to watch my father and mother closely to learn what I could do to please them, just as I did with my school teachers and playmates." It was thus, by getting along with people, he discovered, that he could nearly always get what he wanted. By all surviving evidence, he was an exceptionally alert, good little boy of sunny disposition who, with the glasses that so greatly magnified his blue eyes, looked as bright and interested as could be. Myra Ewan, the first-grade teacher, remembered never having to reprimand him. "He just smiled his way along," she said. A report card for second grade shows him consistently in the 90s in spelling, reading, and deportment. His lowest grade for the first marking period was an 86 in writing. Naturally left-handed, he was being taught to use his right hand. But by the third marking period, he had brought that up to a 90, while for both language and arithmetic, he received a perfect 100%. The fourth marking period is missing because in midwinter, early in 1894, both he and Vivian came down with diphtheria. And though Vivian recovered quickly, Harry took a dramatic turn for the worse. He became paralyzed in his legs and arms and could only lie helplessly. For months Matt wheeled him about in a baby carriage until abruptly, miraculously, he recovered, and from that point on was seldom sick again. When it was suggested to Vivian years later that his mother had to have been terribly frightened by the crisis, he said she didn't scare easy. Tutored through the summer, Harry made such progress that he was allowed to skip third grade and go directly into fourth. By now also he was reading everything I could get my hands on, histories and encyclopedias and everything else. For his 10th birthday in the spring of 1894, his mother presented him with a set of large illustrated volumes grandly titled in gold leaf, Great Men and Famous Women. He would later count the moment as one of life's turning points. There were 4 volumes, Soldiers and Sailors, Statesmen and Sages, Workmen and Heroes, and Artists and Authors. They were not books for children, but anthologies of essays from Harper's and other leading American and English magazines. The subjects, numbering in the hundreds, ranged from Moses to Grover Cleveland. The authors included Edward Everett Hale on Goethe, Lord Macaulay on Samuel Johnson, H. Rider Haggard on Cortes, and young Theodore Roosevelt on Winfield Scott. Harry would eventually plow his way through all of them, Soldiers and Sailors appealing especially. He dreamed of becoming a great general. He loved best the story of Hannibal, who had only one eye. There is not in all history, he read, so wonderful an example of what a single man of genius may achieve against tremendous odds. Of the American heroes, his favorites, not surprisingly, were Andrew Jackson and Robert E. Lee, who was his mother's idol. It was to be worthy of her, he would one day confide to a friend, that he studied the careers of great men. Included in the Lee biography was a letter from Lee to his son written in 1860. Though she could never have found the words, it was what Matt herself might have written to the boy as the new century approached. You must be frank with the world. Frankness is the child of honesty and courage. Say just what you mean to do on every occasion and take it for granted you mean to do right. Never do anything wrong to make a friend or keep one. The man who requires you to do so is dearly purchased at a sacrifice. Deal kindly but firmly with all your classmates. You will find it the policy which wears best. Above all, do not appear to others what you are not. Matt and John Truman both wanted books in the house. John kept loose change in a tray from an old steamer trunk to save for a set of Shakespeare. Harry would never recall being bored, not once, he said, because we had a house full of books. He read the Bible, twice through by the time he was 12, he later claimed, pored over Plutarch's Lives, a gift from his father, and in time to come read all of the new set of Shakespeare. The reading was not something you talked about outside the house, he explained. It was just something you did. Home now was a white-clapboard carpenter's plan book house not unlike a number of others in Independence, except for a cupola with a gilded rooster weather vane. Sloping away at the back was an unusually deep lot of several acres where John Truman, an avid gardener, grew strawberries and vegetables, and kept cows, horses, and whatever livestock he happened to be trading at the moment, which could be a surprising number. For a time there were no fewer than 500 goats quartered on the property. Trying to sink a well, he hit natural gas, with which he heated both his house and that of a neighbor. It was a rare piece of good luck for John Truman. Beyond the back fence, about 150 yards or so distant, was the Missouri Pacific Depot, while on the north side of the house the main tracks ran so close the trains would rattle the kitchen dishes. The soot and noise were something for Matt to contend with, not to say the smell of 500 goats. Harry was fascinated by trains, and daily a total of 23 went by. He would sit alone on the roof of the coal shed behind the house counting freight cars, or, on winter nights, awake in his bed, listen for the eastbound Kansas-Nebraska Limited, which made no stop at Independence and began shrieking its warning whistle miles beyond town. "Harry, do you remember how much you loved the trains?" his cousin Ethel Noland would ask years afterward. "I still do," he said. First and second grade were at the Noland School on South Liberty Street, which was a long walk, but when the new 8-room Columbian School opened on South River Boulevard, he had only to go 3 blocks. He kept to himself more than most boys his age, and in later years he would speak feelingly of the isolation of childhood. It's a very lonely thing being a child. He seldom played games. He was afraid of the rough and tumble of the schoolyard, and because of his glasses felt incapable of any sport that involved a moving ball. He much preferred being at home. To help with the cooking and washing, the family now employed a woman named Caroline Simpson, who was black as your hat, and who, with her husband Lech and 4 children, lived with the Trumans. Caroline Simpson taught Harry to cook on the big wood stove and talked to him by the hour. He liked the warmth and chatter of the kitchen, liked to look after his little sister. He would sit with her in a rocking chair for hours at a time, braiding her hair or singing her to sleep. No one was ever so nice to her as her brother Harry, Mary Jane would say in later years. Outside in the yard, he never took his eyes off her, afraid she might hurt herself, as he once had. The cellar door had slammed on his foot and cut off the end of his big toe. Mama had rushed to the rescue, found the severed piece, and held it in place until the doctor arrived to secure it with a coating of crystalline iodoform and a bandage. For a small boy, he was also abnormally neat and clean. John Truman was the kind of father who wanted everything looking just so: grass clipped around fence posts, horses slicked up, and his children turned out in like fashion. But in a photograph of Harry made in Kansas City when he was 13 and about to enter high school, he looks not just spotless, every detail in order, but like a boy who will stay that way. He was never popular like other boys, never one of the fighters, as he called them. Reminiscing long afterward, he spoke of the teasing he endured because of his glasses. To tell the truth, I was kind of a sissy, he would say, using the hated word. He ran from fights, he admitted. Yet his brother Vivian had no memory of Harry being teased about his glasses, and to judge by the recollections of several boyhood friends, he wasn't considered a sissy exactly, only different, serious, as one recalled. They wanted to call him a sissy, but they just didn't do it because they had a lot of respect for him. I remember one time we were playing Jesse James or Robbers, and we were the Dalton brothers out in Kansas, and we were arguing about them. We got the history mixed up. But Harry came in and straightened it out, just who were the Dalton brothers and how many got killed. Things like that the boys had a lot of respect for. They didn't call him sissy. With girls of his own age, he was so shy he could barely speak. His initial brush with other children and independence was at Sunday school when the family first moved to town. Matt had sent him to the big new red-brick First Presbyterian Church on Lexington Street rather than to one of the Baptist churches because the Presbyterian minister had been especially welcoming to her. At the Presbyterian Sunday School, Harry met a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl named Elizabeth Wallace and decided she was the most entrancing creature he had ever seen. But it was 5 years before he dared say a word to her. The only girls with whom he felt at ease were his cousins, Ethel and Nellie Noland, the daughters of his father's sister Ella and her husband, Joseph Noland. His days passed largely in the company of women, Mama, Caroline Simpson, his teachers, or Grandma Young, who came often to visit. He was surrounded by womenfolk, and he got along with them splendidly, kidding and telling stories. His mother liked to say he was intended for a girl anyway, an observation he seems to have taken always in good spirit. 2. John Truman was getting on in the world. There was money now for servants, books, for studio photographs. As a surprise for the children, he bought a pair of matched red goats with custom-made harness and a miniature farm wagon. The little rig became the talk of the neighborhood. John was an early riser, an all-day striver, and thought to be pretty ingenious besides, because of his backyard gas well and various inventive ideas. He patented a staple puller for use on barbed wire fences. For an automatic railroad switch that he devised, the Missouri Pacific reportedly offered an annual royalty of $2,000. When the Chicago and Alton topped that with an offer of $2,500, 4 times what most American families had to live on in a year, John asked for double the amount, with the result that both railroads turned him down and adopted another version of the same thing, pirated his idea, apparently, and he wound up with nothing. It was a story told usually to show just how stubborn John Truman could be. As a livestock trader, he stood well in the community. He had a good eye. He could determine the age of mules or horses at a glance, seldom needing to examine their teeth, and though a quiet man, he had perfected a nice line of trade talk. More important, John Truman's word was good. A mighty good trader, John Truman, recalled a neighbor. Very stubborn, but on the square. Because of Harry's obvious affection for his mother, his eagerness to please her, and the enjoyment he took from her company as time went on, much would be said later of her influence, the extent to which he was his mother's son. But as time would also tell, he and his father had much in common, more indeed than either of them realized through much of Harry's boyhood, and the influence of the father on the son would never be discounted by those who knew John Truman or by anyone in the family, including Harry himself. Small and compact, like a jockey, John had a weathered, sunburned face and crow's feet that gave a hint of a smile around the eyes. The grin, when it came, was the kind people warmed to and remembered, as they remembered the temper. Touchy about his size, his honor, he would explode at the least affront, fight like a buzzsaw, as Harry would say. Once at the courthouse, when a lawyer accused him of lying, John took after the man with his fists, chasing him out the door and into the street. On Election Day, John Truman was nearly always in a fight. One boyhood friend of Harry's, Mize Peters, who was also the son of a horse trader, remembered a man coming into his father's place, his head covered with blood, saying he had had an argument with John Truman, who hit him with a whip. To the town, such ferocity seemed a remarkable thing in someone so unprepossessing physically and so good-natured ordinarily. A fiery fellow, it would be said, but a man of John Truman's integrity and industry, you excuse a whole lot of things. Like many men of the time, John had a strong sentimental veneration of women. No one could make remarks about my aunts or my mother in my father's presence without getting into serious trouble, Harry recalled. Of the 3 children, Mary Jane was John's favorite. Papa, it seems, was as partial to Mary Jane as Mama was to Harry. That Harry spent so much time watching over Mary Jane was in part because he knew how much it would please Papa. Unlike his own father, John was considered a liberal in religion. He professed great faith in God, but faith also in what could be accomplished through courage and determination. He had no use for a coward, according to a niece named Grace Summer. He raised his children to have faith in themselves and their potentialities. Assisted by the black hired man, Lech Simpson, John did a little farming still on rented land south of town, and occasionally he dabbled in real estate. Possibly, too, by this time he had begun speculating in grain futures in Kansas City. He was looking always for the main chance, wanting desperately to get rich. Meanwhile, as Harry said, he would trade nearly anything he owned. In 1895, when the boy was 11, John traded their house for another several blocks to the north, receiving some $5,400 in the bargain. Though the new house had less property than the one on Chrysler Avenue, it stood on a corner lot at Waldo Street and River Boulevard, a more fashionable neighborhood and within easy walking distance of the courthouse square. Chrysler Avenue had never been the wrong side of the tracks, but for an ambitious man, 909 Waldo was unquestionably progress in the right direction. A down payment was made on a new piano for Matt, who would be remembered playing for her own amusement and amazement. When Harry showed signs of interest, she first tried teaching him herself, then arranged for regular lessons with the young woman next door, Florence Burris. A piano in the parlor had become part of the good life in America, a sign of prosperity and wholesome home entertainment, and the Trumans had an upright Kimball, the most popular piano of the day, priced at about $200. Music for the multitudes was the Kimball Company's slogan. Customarily, piano lessons were for the young women of the household, but Harry took to it wholeheartedly, pleased by his progress and by the approval of both parents. For Harry, no less than for his father, life was picking up. The new neighborhood was filled with children of his own age. He was making friends as never before. The Waldo Street years would be remembered, like those on the farm, as nothing but wonderful times. He had a gang now. Our house became headquarters for all the boys and girls around. There was a wonderful barn with stalls for horses and cows, a corn crib and a hay loft in which all the kids met and cooked up plans for all sorts of adventures. Mama remained very patient, whatever went on. As he started high school, the friendships meant even more. Paul Bryant lived on the other side of Waldo at Little Woodland College for Women, where his father was president. Across the back alley was Fielding Houchins, the Baptist minister's son. Elmer Twyman was the son of the Truman family doctor who had seen Harry through the siege of diphtheria and restored the severed tip of his toe. There was Tasker Taylor, who could draw better than anyone, and tall, shy Charlie Ross, who never missed a day of school and who, like Harry, read everything in sight. Yet as much as he liked them all, Harry had no best pal among the boys. His only close friends remained his girl cousins Ethel and Nellie Noland, who were as good-natured and well-read as he, interested in everything, not at all vain or pretty, and importantly devoted to him. Harry once calculated that he had a grand total of 39 cousins, but Ethel and Nellie were the favorites, and they would remain so all of his life. Ethel in particular would understand him as almost no one else ever did. Just 6 months older than Harry, Ethel was a year ahead in school. Nellie, who was 4 years older, was very like a big sister to him. As a threesome, they spent hours together after school and in the evenings, usually at the Noland house on Maple Avenue. In summer, the girls were regular visitors at the farm on Blue Ridge. Harry was always considerate, always companionable, Ethel remembered. Harry was always fun. They read Shakespeare aloud, taking parts. After doing Hamlet, Ethel began calling him Horatio, brave Horatio, the staunch friend. The Nolan sisters knew, too, how much he still secretly cared for Elizabeth Wallace, who had been in his class from the time he switched to the Columbian school in 4th grade, and who, year after year, because of the alphabetical seating arrangement, occupied the desk immediately behind him. Bessie, as everyone called her, lived on North Delaware Street, 2.5 blocks from the Trumans, in a tall frame house, number 608, with a bur oak shading the front lawn. If I succeeded in carrying her books to school and back home for her, I had a big day, he would later say, appraising how far he had advanced in overcoming his shyness. She was his ideal. She was popular. She stood out in class, always dressed in the latest thing. A natural all-round athlete, she played baseball as well as a boy. As third baseman, she had no trouble with the long throw to first. She could run faster than her brothers and beat them in tennis. She was better at tennis than almost anyone her age, as Harry knew from watching her on the courts at Woodland College. In winter he would stand and watch her race off on skates across the college pond. She could skate, she could dance, she could do so much that he could not, that he had never learned. She could even whistle through her teeth, as almost no girl ever could. Her street, North Delaware, with its ample houses and sidewalks of hexagonal flagstone, was considered the finest street in Independence, the houses lending an air of dignity to the whole neighborhood west of the square. The tall gray residence of her wealthy grandfather, George Porterfield Gates, up the street on North Delaware, was one of the showplaces of town. Grandmother Gates was English. At Christmas, Bessie gave gifts to her friends wrapped in fancy paper and wore silk dresses to formal parties and dances of the kind to which Harry was never invited. Besides, Bessie was a Presbyterian, which socially put her at the top of the poll. Since the war, the Baptists had slipped to perhaps 3rd or 4th place, below the Campbellites and the Northern Methodists and Southern Methodists, but were still ahead of the Lutherans, the Catholics, and the reorganized Latter-day Saints, those Mormons who had come back from Utah. Asked long afterward whether she remembered Harry Truman hanging about the Wallace house in the years they were all growing up, Bessie's close friend and next-door neighbor, Mary Paxton, responded emphatically, No, Harry was a Baptist. 3. It was, as people said, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody and everybody's business. The population was 6,000 and growing, but only slowly. Compared to Kansas City, it was a sleepy backwater, church-going, conservative, rooted to the past, exactly as most residents preferred. Kansas City was a brassy Yankee town, money-wise and full of new people. Independence was Southern in both spirit and pace, really more Southern than Midwestern, and very set in its ways. There had been considerable building since the war, the coming of the railroads, the pell-mell growth of Kansas City, the rise of several new local enterprises had had an effect. North Delaware Street, which ran north-south, 4 blocks west of the square, was a perfect example of the changed look. The large Boleyn house, the Sawyer house with its Tiffany glass windows, the big Gates place were all new since the war, like the money that built them. The Boleyns belonged to the family that founded Kansas City's most popular dry goods firm, Emery Bird Thayer. Aaron Sawyer was head of the Bank of Independence, which had been organized since the war. George Porterfield Gates was partner in the Wagner Gates Milling Company of Independence, founded in 1866, which hit a bonanza with Queen of the Pantry flour, a product known throughout the Midwest. Gates himself was part of a post-war Yankee influx. He had come from Vermont by way of Illinois, joined William Waggoner in the milling business in 1883, and 2 years later greatly remodeled and expanded his relatively modest house at the corner of North Delaware and Blue Avenue, spending in all, according to the Independence Sentinel, a fabulous $8,000. Painted gray with black trim at the windows, the finished clapboard mansion had 14 rooms, verandas front and rear, fancy fretwork, tinted, flashed glass in the front bay windows, slate roof, gas illumination, and hot and cold running water. Gates's partner, William Waggoner, lived in even grander style across from the mill on Pacific Street, in the house George Caleb Bingham once occupied, but that Waggoner had done over, sparing no expense. It sat on a knoll in a leafy, park-like setting of 20 acres. The Swope place on South Pleasant Street had a ballroom on the top floor. The Swope fortune came from land in Kansas City. The Vale House on North Liberty, the showiest house in Independence, was a towering, stone-trimmed, red-brick Victorian wedding cake with 31 rooms and Carrara marble fireplaces. The Vale stable had mahogany-paneled stalls. There was a greenhouse and 4 full-time gardeners. If Harvey Vale, who made his money in pure water and contract mail delivery, was not the richest man in town, he certainly lived as though he were. Overall, it was quite a handsome community. The primary streets were paved, clean, and shaded by large old elms and cottonwoods. People took pride in their gardens. On summer evenings after dark, families sat visiting on front porches, their voices part of the night for anybody crossing the lawns between houses. National holidays and politics provided what little excitement occurred from one year to another. Most memorable for young Harry Truman was the day of Grover Cleveland's second victory in 1892, when the family was still in the house on Chrysler Avenue. John Truman had scrambled to the top of the roof to tie a flag to the gilded weather vane, and that night, looking extremely proud, he rode a gray horse in a torchlight parade. Bessie Wallace's friend Mary Paxton, a latter-day chronicler of town life, remembered how the men with their blazing torches came swinging down North Delaware, leaving a trail of light under the dark trees. She, Harry, all their generation would remember it as a night of nights, since 20 years went by before Democrats, with the election of Wilson, could celebrate another presidential victory. In lots of ways, it was a country town still. Roosters crowed at dawn. Dinner remained a midday meal in many households. The standard Sunday dinner after church was fried chicken, buttered peas, mashed potatoes, creamed gravy, and beaten biscuits, which, being made of queen-of-the-pantry flour, a soft wheat flour, were understood to be the world's best. Mud-spattered buggies and farm wagons clogged the square on Saturday nights when the farmers came to town for haircuts and supplies. Town boys grew up with farmers' chores as part of the daily routine. Harry and Vivian had cows to milk, horses to curry, water and feed, wood to split for the kitchen stove. On clear winter nights, with the trees bare and the soft glow of gas and oil lamps still the only light in the windows of town, stars in the black sky overhead blazed with a clarity that residents of a later, electrified era would never experience. Local boosters insisted on calling it a city and bragged about the new electric plant under construction at a cost of $30,000, or the new high school, which had cost still more. Local merchants were described as unexcelled in regard to integrity, uprightness, and faithfulness in business affairs and cordiality and good nature in social life. Yet for all this there was an air of great understated gentility, even sophistication. There were those in town, among the old-moneyed families, who talked of travels in Europe or summers in Colorado Springs. Study groups met to discuss literature and poetry, and with a degree of appreciation and vitality that could take visitors by surprise. The teaching in the schools Harry attended was superb. In addition to Woodland College for women, there was Presbyterian College, also for women, and St. Mary's Academy for girls. These, to be sure, were only tiny, struggling institutions. The usual graduating class at Woodland numbered just a dozen or so, but they were well regarded and cause for much local pride. Independence, remembered Ethel Noland years later, stood for culture, a claim easy for outsiders to scoff at, she knew, but that she and others like her took very much to heart. There was conversation, she said. I mean by that, talk about what was going on in the world, talk about ideas.
The town supported 2 bookstores, and most of the leading families took the Kansas City papers, in addition to the Sentinel or the Jackson Examiner. Kansas City, furthermore, was only a 10-mile ride by trolley or on the new train known as the Air Line, so there was little sense of being cut off from the wide world, if the wide world was what you wished. And with so much history attached to the town, no one with a feeling for the past could find it uninteresting. No town in the West is richer in historical interest than the beautiful city of Independence, declared a new guide to independence. At the point south of town where the wagon trains had crossed Blue River, crevices worn by their wheels were still plainly evident. George Caleb Bingham had painted his Order Number 11 in one of the old outbuildings at the Wagoner estate. The brick walls of the Chrisman Sawyer Bank, on the northwest corner of the courthouse square, showed the scars still of Civil War battles, and on pleasant mornings in the years of Harry Truman's boyhood, old Marshal Peacock could often be seen walking stiffly about town, a spare, erect figure with a white beard and cane who, as everyone knew, still carried the bullet fired by Jim Crow Childs lodged in his spine. George Porterfield Gates, Bessie Wallace's grandfather, liked to frighten and delight Bessie and her friends with his tale of a late-night drive home in a buggy from a long-ago country wedding. A mysterious rider had appeared out of the dark, put a gun to Gates's neck, and held it there all the way into town. It was Jim Crow Childs, who, Gates was sure, had only murder in his heart. But as they turned down North Delaware Street, Jim Crow laughed his fiendish laugh and vanished in the night as suddenly as he had appeared. The atmosphere remained pervadingly Southern, antebellum Old South, unreconstructed. Handkerchiefs were waved whenever the band played Dixie. The United Daughters of the Confederacy thrived, and such formal parties as attended by genteel young folk like Bessie Wallace and her friends were hardly different from those put on in Macon or Tuscaloosa, from the floral decorations and twining stair rails to the refreshments of chicken salad and Charlotte Russe. The biggest memorial in Woodland Cemetery was the Confederate Monument. Portraits of Lee and Jackson were displayed prominently in many front parlors, and in summer, Quantrill's boys, grizzled, tobacco-chewing border war veterans dressed as if for church, gathered for day-long outdoor reunions, a portrait of Quantrill draped in crepe as their centerpiece. Often Jesse James's brother Frank appeared for such occasions, causing great excitement. At school, one of Harry's favorite teachers, Ardelia Hardin, who taught Latin, would describe for the class how her father had been hit 3 times during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg and left for dead until discovered by Catholic sisters and taken to a Baltimore hospital, where, once recovered, he refused to swear allegiance to the United States and for this was imprisoned for the remainder of the war. Harry always wanted to know about that, Miss Hardin would remember half a century later, very pleased. Virtually the entire town was American-born, though nearly every black resident past the age of 40 had been born in slavery. Immigrant Irish, Italians, Croatians, and other foreign impoverished people of the kind crowded into the vile west bottoms of Kansas City were rarely ever seen in Independence. Black residents lived in what was called Nigger Neck, a cluster of makeshift houses and shacks in a persimmon grove northwest of the square. Blacks were unwelcome at most stores and were denied use of the town library. Black children went to a separate school, the Young School, named for the free black wagon maker of pioneer days, Hiram Young. And while white families like the Trumans might feel great lifelong affection for their own black servants, words like nigger and coon were used as a matter of course in so-called polite society. And below the surface always lay a threat of violence, should any blacks forget their place. News of lynchings in the South were given lurid play by both local papers, invariably in the spirit that the victim only got what he had coming to him. The summer of 1901, the year Harry finished high school, the Jackson Examiner declared on its editorial page, "The community at large need not be especially surprised if there is a Negro lynching in Independence. The conditions are favorable at this time. There are a lot of worthless young Negro men in town who do nothing. They do not pretend to work and stand around on the streets and swear and make remarks about ladies and others who may pass by. They crowd into the electric cars and become offensive." There were also in town, the editors were careful to add, many law-abiding Negroes who are good citizens and who understand the truth of what we say as well as anyone. Certain precepts and bywords were articles of faith in such a place, in such times. and nearly everybody growing up there was imbued with them, in principle at least. Honesty was the best policy. It saved time and worry because if you always told the truth, you never had to keep track of what you said. Make yourself useful. Anything worthwhile required effort. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Never, never give up, Harry's father would say. Children were a reflection of their parents. Now, Harry, you be good, his mother would tell him time after time as he went out the door. He appears never to have questioned such dictates any more than he questioned the established inequality of black people. In those days, he would remember, right was right and wrong was wrong, and he didn't have to talk about it. Many of the most familiar guidelines came directly from the Bible. Honor thy father and mother. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. Be of good cheer. From Sunday school and his own reading of the Bible, Harry knew many passages by heart, particularly Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Ye are the salt of the earth. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. He memorized a prayer, one he would say through much of his life. O almighty and everlasting God, creator of heaven, earth, and the universe, help me to be, to think, to act what is right, because it is right. Make me truthful, honest, and honorable in all things. Make me intellectually honest for the sake of right and honor, and without thought of reward to me. Give me the ability to be charitable, forgiving, and patient with my fellow men. Help me to understand their motives and their shortcomings, even as thou understandest mine. Amen, amen, amen. Say what you mean what you say, he was taught at home. Keep your word. Never get too big for your britches. Never forget a friend. They were more than words to the wise. They were bedrock, as clearly established, as integral to the way of life, it seemed, as were the very landmarks of the community, its schools, church steeples, and courthouse. Not everyone lived up to them, of course, but to Harry it seemed everyone ought to try. The square was the center of the world if the town was the limit of your experience, and at age 14, while still in high school, Harry went to work on the square at J.H. Clinton's drugstore. It was his first paying job. Clinton's drugstore stood at the northeast corner of the square. Proprietor Clinton lived upstairs. Harry's job was to come in each weekday morning at 6:30 to open up the place, sweep the sidewalk, mop the floor, wipe the counters, and do as much overall dusting and cleaning as possible before 7 o'clock when Mr. Clinton came down and it was time for Harry to leave for school. More than half a century later, he could remember it all in detail. There must have been 1,000 bottles to dust and yards of patent medicine cases and shelves to clean. At least it seemed that way because I never finished the bottles and shelves by school time and had to start the next morning where I'd left off the day before. By the time I got around them all, it was time to start over. 2 large glass vases in the front windows had to be cleaned and dusted, as well as a surrounding display of patent medicines. The windows were to be washed once a week, the prescription cases dusted very, very carefully. Saturdays and Sundays, the boy worked from 4 in the afternoon until 10 at night by the courthouse clock, when Mr. Clinton would lock up and Harry would head off in the dark, the lights in other shop windows along the square going out one by one. Hurrying, he could make it home in 12 minutes. J.H. Clinton advertised cigars, smokers' supplies and tobaccos, perfumes, toilet articles, soaps and stationery, prescriptions carefully compounded day or night. But the store accommodated the town in yet another way, as Harry soon discovered, and it was this, apparently, that awakened him for the first time to the hypocrisies of certain prominent citizens known for their moral rectitude, the high hats, as he called them. In a little closet under the prescription case, which faced the front and shut off the view of the back end of the store, was an assortment of whiskey bottles. Early in the morning, sometimes before Mr. Clinton arrived, the good church members and anti-saloon leaguers would come in for their early morning drink behind the prescription case at 10 cents an ounce. They would wipe their mouths, peep through the observation hole in front of the case, and depart. This procedure gave a 14-year-old boy quite a viewpoint on the public front of leading citizens and amen corner-praying churchmen. He would set the bottle on the counter and wait. They'd put their dimes on the counter, and I'd leave all those dimes there until Mr. Clinton came in, and he'd put them in the cash register. It was because these customers were such counterfeits that he hated having any part in the transaction. Far better, he thought, were the tough old birds around town who bought a proper drink in a real saloon whenever they wished, regardless of appearances. The drugstore was one of several shops and stores fashioned out of what had once been the old Noland House, the frontier hotel and saloon where the body of Harry's infamous uncle, Jim Crow Childs, had been laid out after the shooting, a point of history Harry surely knew all about but never spoke of. The store was at the corner of Maple and Main, which, with Lexington and Liberty, framed the square. A jewelry store, a bookshop, 2 groceries, the Hotel Metropolitan, H.W. Rummel's Harness and Saddle Shop, a dry goods store, and the Courthouse Exchange Saloon were in the same block on Maple. Elsewhere around the square, all facing the courthouse, were 3 more drugstores, 2 more saloons, A.J. Bunshoe's department store, once a patron, always a patron, 2 barber shops, a tobacco shop, a shoe store, a theater, an opera house, a hardware store, a bakery, and an ice cream parlor. 3 banks, the First National, the Bank of Independence, and the old brick Chrisman Sawyer, stood prominently at 3 different corners, while upstairs, over several of the stores, were various law and dental offices and Miss Dunlap's dancing classes. A lumber yard, the Western Union offices, a barber shop for blacks, 2 livery stables, a feed store, the post office, the town jail, and the airline railroad station were just off the square, which meant that most of life's necessities were all extremely handy, including the Ott Mitchell undertaking parlor, which stood catty-cornered to J.H. Clinton's drugstore. But for size and impressiveness, nothing approached the courthouse, rising from its shaded lawn at the center of the square. The simple, dignified little building of old, with its fanlight over the door, had long since disappeared, swallowed up by a great red brick renovation in the high Victorian mode with a mansard-roofed clock tower 5 stories tall. The courthouse was the focal point of Independence. The clock tower could be seen for miles, jutting above the trees. And the courthouse, of course, was Democratic, for though Republicans were not unknown in Independence, the town remained solidly Democratic. People were born and raised Democrats as they were born and raised Baptists or Catholics. It was not something you questioned. As one said, you were a Democrat come hell or high water, or you were a Republican. In the war months, on wooden benches in the dappled light of the courthouse lawn, the town loafers and philosophers congregated. Courthouse politicians, tradesmen, out-of-town salesmen, store clerks and bank presidents, mothers in long skirts shopping with their daughters, a good part of the town, passed up and down the sidewalks, stopping frequently to visit. The dark green Kansas City streetcar arrived and departed, making its cautious turn at Liberty and Lexington with bell clanging and a screech of wheels. In full summer, farm wagons laden with fresh produce lined the curbstones. Some summers, to keep the dust down, the town water wagon had to circle the square several times daily. To go up to the square each morning to a regular job was for a boy to be very like a man. It was to be known, to be spoken to, and spoken well of if one were a brisk, cheerful, dependable boy like Harry Truman. And however disillusioned he may have been by some of the clientele at the drugstore, he was clearly enjoying himself and probably would have stayed on had his father not intervened. His first week's wages of $3 silver were, in memory, the biggest thing that ever happened to me. He bought a present for his mother and tried to give what money was left to his father, who said kindly that he should keep it for himself. After 3 months, John Truman told the boy he had done enough. Better that he concentrate on his studies. 4. He grew dutifully, conspicuously studious, spending long afternoons in the town library, watched over by a white plaster bust of Ben Franklin. Housed in 2 rooms adjacent to the high school, the library contained perhaps 2,000 volumes. Harry and Charlie Ross vowed to read all of them, encyclopedias included, and both later claimed to have succeeded. Harry liked Mark Twain and Franklin's autobiography. He read Sir Walter Scott because Scott was Bessie Wallace's favorite author. The fact that the town librarian, Carrie Wallace, was a cousin to Bessie may also have influenced the boy's show of scholarly dedication. "I don't know anybody in the world that ever read as much or as constantly as he did," remembered Ethel Noland. He was what you call a bookworm. History became a passion as he worked his way through a shelf of standard works on ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. He had a real feeling for history, Ethel said, that it wasn't something in a book, that it was part of life, a section of life or a former time, that it was of interest because it had to do with people. He himself later said it was true facts that he wanted. Reading history to me was far more than a romantic adventure. It was solid instruction and wise teaching which I somehow felt that I wanted and needed. He decided, he said, that men make history, otherwise there would be no history. History did not make the man, he was quite certain. His list of heroes advanced. To Andrew Jackson, Hannibal, and Robert E. Lee were added Cincinnatus, Scipio, Cyrus the Great, and Gustavus Adolphus, the 17th century Swedish king. No Jeffersons or Lincolns or Leonardos were part of his pantheon as yet. Whatever it was that made other boys of turn-of-the-century America venerate Andrew Carnegie or Thomas Edison, he had none of it. The great men by his lights were still the great generals. Few boys in town ever went to high school. The great majority went to work. High school, like piano lessons, was primarily for girls. In Harry's class, largest yet at the new high school, there were 30 girls and just 11 boys. Harry was good in Latin, very good in math, poor in spelling, and greatly influenced by his teachers, who were all women except for Professor W.L.C. Palmer, the principal, who taught science, the one subject Harry didn't care for. The women were spinsters as required by the school system. When his Latin teacher, Ardelia Hardin, she with the Pickett's charge grandfather, became the wife of Professor Palmer, she had to give up teaching. Known by everybody, they comprised a kind of town institution unto themselves, as upholders of standards. They were the salt of the earth, Harry would say. They gave us our high ideals, and they hardly ever received more than $40 a month. They taught the old rooted values, loyalty, love of home, unquestioning patriotism, no less than Latin, history, or Shakespeare. She could never enter the classroom, said Miss Tilly Brown, without hearing the admonition to put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the spot on which thou standest is holy ground. And while some may have snickered at her manner, none doubted her sincerity. The influence of his teachers on his life, Harry later said, was second only to that of his mother, and when crediting a Tilly Brown or a Margaret Phelps for all they had done for him, he did so with the assumption that everybody of his generation had a Tilly Brown or Margaret Phelps in their background, and could therefore understand how he felt. The panorama of history as taught by Margaret Phelps began with Adam and Eve. Tall, slender, her upswept hair always in place, she was an exacting person and somewhat frightening to most of her pupils until they got to know her. Harry liked her best of all his teachers, and it was in history that he did best. There was no more important field of study, Margaret Phelps affirmed in a memorable statement of faith. It cultivates every faculty of the mind, enlarges sympathies, liberalizes thought and feeling, furnishes and approves the highest standards of character. Tilly Brown, Matilda D. Brown, the English teacher, was hardly less impressive, a genius at making us appreciate good literature. And two of Harry's composition books done under her guidance would survive, one from 1899, the other dated 1900 to 1901, his senior year. His focus was on people and moral ideals. He responded strongly to the stamp of patriotism on an author or a character. He abhorred sham. Courage counted above all, to judge by what he wrote. At times, when writing of the corrupting influences of money and of what he called the passions, the boy seemed wise beyond his years. How much of what he wrote was his own, how much the outlook of Tilly Brown, is impossible to know, but as one who by his own account knew how to please a teacher, he may well have been giving her as much Brown as Truman in his value judgments. Of James Fenimore Cooper, he wrote in 1899, "The name Cooper suggests to me stories of Indians, the sea, and the Revolution, in which we go through a great many adventures and narrow escapes. It also makes me think of a man who upheld his country and who would not step out of his way because it was hard or because he had to meet a quarrel. He was a man who would not let another run over him. He would support an argument to the last." Cooper's books, he also observed, are interesting and famous, but his sentences are too long. Under the heading Courage, he wrote in a strong, clear, straightaway hand, "The virtue I call courage is not in always facing the foe, but in taking care of those at home. A true heart, a strong mind, and a great deal of courage, and I think a man will get through the world." In an essay on the Merchant of Venice, in the composition book from senior year, writing on Antonio, he said that though ideal men were few, his ideal man, should in the first place be brave, then he should fear his God. He must not be cold, haughty, or hypocritical, but he must have a warm heart and love someone. A woman is preferable. Shylock interested him primarily because Shylock was a strong man. Shylock's failing was that he let his passions rule him. When a man loses control of his passions, he is gone, wrote 16-year-old Harry Truman. Further along, he had this to say about Bassanio. This world is made up of all sorts of conditions of men, from the best one could wish to the basest one could imagine. There are men who love money who will do anything for money, who will sell their souls for money. Then there are men who love money for the good that is in it, who like to use it to make others happy. There are men who love everything worldly, love wine, women, and a good time. Then there are those who are so religious they have no time to think of anyone or anything. These men are extremists who run the thing into the ground. I like a man who has enough worldly wisdom to take care of himself, but I like him to have time to love both his God and those around him. But it was the boy's steadfastness that most impressed his teachers, said Ardelia Hardin. When called on to speak in class, he would stand clear of his desk and square his shoulders before saying a word. What his grades were remains unknown, since the school's records were later destroyed in a fire. Measured by the time and effort expended, the most important activity in his life was the piano. Having progressed beyond the abilities of Miss Burris, who taught by a numbers system, he began going twice weekly to Kansas City for lessons with Mrs. E.C. White, a gifted teacher who had studied under Fanny Bloomfield Zeisler, one of the leading American pianists of the era, and with Theodore Leschetsky, who had been a teacher of Paderewski. Harry grew extremely fond of Grace White. He was fond of most older people, as his cousin Ethel observed. He was brought up to be fond of them. She opened a new world for him, and his response was to work with exceptional determination, practicing 2 hours a day without fail, beginning at 5 o'clock every morning. As a grown man, he would often speak lightly of tickling the ivories, as if it were only something he had happened to pick up along the way. But the slender, straight-backed youth with the round eyeglasses who sat at the keyboard in the half-light of dawn every morning was in dead earnest. He thought he had the makings of a concert pianist, and apparently so did Mrs. White. He was willing not only to do the work, but to face whatever ridicule might come. His friend Charlie Ross would remember Harry going up the street with a music roll under his arm, hurrying to catch the trolley for Kansas City. Mothers held him up as a model, so he took a lot of kidding. It required a lot of courage for a kid to take music lessons in a town like Independence. Another friend, Henry Bundschuh, said Harry was the sort of boy who seemed to do whatever his mother told him. He also loved music. He genuinely adored the great classical works Mrs. White guided him through and insisted he learn. On a big Steinway in her old-fashioned house on Brooklyn Street in Kansas City, she drilled him in Bach, Beethoven, Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, pieces by Weber and Grieg. He learned the new Woodland sketches by the contemporary American composer Edward MacDowell. For the rest of his life he could play Paderewski's Minuet in G and several Chopin waltzes by heart. He was moved by sad music, Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique and Chopin's Funeral March. Von Weber, he thought, wrote beautiful things, the Rondo Brillante, the Polka Brillante. But he liked still more the Chopin waltzes and polonaises. Mozart he loved most of all, and with Mrs. White's help eventually mastered the Ninth Sonata. He was playing serious music with utmost seriousness and going to concerts at every opportunity. Many of the concert greats of the day came to Kansas City. Twice, when Fanny Bloomfield Zeisler performed, first at the Lyceum, later at Pepper Hall, Harry was in the audience. He heard her play Scarlatti's Pastorale and Capriccio, and Beethoven's Sonata Opus 111, which a reviewer in the Kansas City Journal called her most profoundly developed offering. This was in 1898, the year he worked in the drugstore when he was 14. Later he heard Joseph Levine, who was the best on the globe, he thought. In 1900, when Paderewski came to Kansas City on tour, Mrs. White arranged a meeting backstage with the great man, who treated Harry to a private demonstration of how to play his Minuet in G. As a boy brimming with such musical aspiration, his head filled with Shakespeare and noble Romans, as one who had taken teasing in a town where appearances were vital, and where every youngster bore the constant scrutiny of innumerable aunts, uncles, teachers, shopkeepers, and neighbors, he might well have burned to rebel. He might have longed for escape, as had Willa Cather growing up in Red Cloud, Nebraska, or to strike back somehow against the kind of small-town minds and souls that Sinclair Lewis would remember from boyhood in Sauk Center, Minnesota. But nowhere in all that Harry Truman wrote and said about his youth, or in the lengthy recollections of him by friends and family, is there even a hint of anger or hurt or frustration over his surroundings. Clearly, he liked Independence, Missouri, and its people. He liked being Harry Truman. He had thinned out, stretched out to perhaps 5'7", which was not as tall as he would be, but above average and already several inches taller than his father. Neat, clean, cheerful, he had still the gift for getting along with almost anyone. People knew who he was, and people liked him, and partly because of the music roll and the eyeglasses. He had no enemies, he held no grudges. He had done no wrong, nor anything yet to be ashamed of, so far as is known. Importantly, his father approved of him, for all their seemingly different interests. Harry was all right, John Truman said. He knew Harry had ability, Vivian remembered. He liked the way he never had an idle moment. Vivian, in contrast to his girlish-sounding name, was a sturdy man's kind of boy, who was good at games and wished no part of books or piano lessons. Already Vivian had shown such a knack for horse trading that John Truman gave him a checkbook and set him up as a partner at the age of 12. Harry, try as he might, had no heart for trade. As he would later explain to Bessie Wallace, "When I buy a cow for $30 and then sell her to someone for $50, it always seems to me that I'm really robbing that person of $20. Where Harry and his father found common ground was in the sociability and excitement of politics. Among the happiest of all Harry's boyhood memories would be the big Democratic picnics every August at Lone Jack. John Truman would have everyone up early. He and the boys would hitch 2 of the best mules to a spring wagon, and with everything ready the whole family would set out for the 5-mile drive, the wagon filled with fried chicken, cakes, and pies. By noon at Lone Jack there would be thousands of people spreading food on tablecloths on the grass and visiting back and forth. Then about 2 the speaking would begin. Harry liked particularly a candidate known as Colonel Crisp, a colonel by agreement, who ran for Congress time after time but never won and was famous for his annual picnic oration on the Battle of Lone Jack during the Civil War. Challenged once on his accuracy by a veteran who had been in the battle, Crisp responded, "God damn an eyewitness anyway. He always spoils a good story." Another speaker, Congressman William S. Cowherd from Lee's Summit, told a story that Harry would take pleasure in retelling the rest of his life. Speaking of certain provisions in a pending tariff bill that he found unpalatable, the congressman was reminded of a farmer on a visit to New York, having his first experience in a fancy hotel dining room. First he was served celery, which he ate, then a bowl of consommé, which he drank. But when the waiter placed a lobster before him, the farmer looked up indignantly and said, "I ate your bouquet, I drank your dishwater, but I'll be darned if I'll eat your bug." Now, in the summer of 1900, Harry went with his father to Kansas City to attend the Democratic National Convention that renominated the great commoner, William Jennings Bryan, to run a second time against William McKinley. John Truman sat in a box seat as the guest of one of Kansas City's most up-and-coming citizens, William T. Kemper, a friend in the grain business and a national committeeman. Harry was consigned to the balcony or ran errands for Kemper and hugely enjoyed himself. He remembered the immense sweep of the great hall and a crowd of 17,000 people, nearly 3 times the population of Independence, all under one roof. The nominating speech for Bryan touched off a demonstration that lasted half an hour. Harry and his father declared themselves thorough Bryan men, and though Bryan and his running mate, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, went down to defeat in November to McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, Bryan remained an idol for Harry as the voice of the common man. The Democrats made imperialism the issue in the election of 1900, but it was McKinley prosperity that carried the country, the Republicans campaigning on the theme of the full dinner pail. How aware the boy may have been of his own family's unprecedented prosperity at the moment is unknown. But by speculating in grain futures, through such contacts as he had established with insiders like William T. Kemper, John Truman was moving rapidly toward his dream of riches. With his senior year underway that same fall, Harry found himself busier than ever. He, Charlie Ross, Tasker Taylor, and several others launched a first yearbook for the school. Charlie named it The Gleam, after Tennyson's poem Merlin and the Gleam. Tasker did the illustrations. As part of their Latin studies, Harry and Charlie worked out translations of Cicero. Salus populi suprema est lex. The people's good is the highest law. Charlie, who was class president as well as editor of The Gleam, was also first in scholarship. With Elmer Twyman, Harry spent weeks building a wooden model of Caesar's bridge over the Rhine, as described in Caesar's commentaries, and met regularly with his cousin Nellie Noland, who was a whiz at Latin. The Noland family by this time had moved to 216 North Delaware, a small frame house opposite the Gates mansion. Best of all, Bessie Wallace was now a part of the group there. She was over a good deal, Cousin Ethel would remember. I don't know whether they got much Latin read or not, because there was a lot of fun going on. Harry had taken up fencing. He had 2 foils, or rapiers, or whatever you called them, and so we would sometimes practice fencing, which we knew absolutely nothing about, but it was fun to try, and we had the porch room here to play and have fun, which we did, with a little Latin intermingled. Progress in the new century were popular topics. Progress is the cry on every hand, wrote Elmer Twyman in The Gleam, and invention, reform, and improvement is everywhere, in weapons, heat, light, food, medicine, building, transportation. Truly we are wizards performing miracles. We lack nothing but the airship and the philosopher's stone, or perhaps the fountain of youth. Harry copied down and saved the lines of a favorite poem by Tennyson, Locksley Hall, describing all the wonders to come, including airships and air warfare and universal law. For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world and all the wonder that would be, saw the heavens filled with commerce, argosies of magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight dropping down with costly bales, heard the heavens filled with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue. Far along the world-wide whisper of the south wind rushing warm, with the standards of the peoples plunging through the thunderstorm. Till the war drum throbbed no longer, and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law.
For the class picture taken outside the school's main entrance, Harry stood by himself in back of the back row. Elmer Twyman, who stood nearby, proudly holding a man's hat, had decided to become a doctor like his father. Charlie Ross, who sat on the ground at the near end of the front row, his long legs drawn up so that his socks were showing, was headed for the University of Missouri and a career in journalism. Harry had removed his glasses for the picture. He was not smiling, only paying attention to the photographer, his right hand resting on the shoulder of the slight, wistful-looking boy in front, Will Garrett, the class poet. Harry had decided to try for West Point. He and Fielding Houchins, who wanted to go to Annapolis, were preparing for the examinations by taking extra hours in history with Miss Phelps. Bookish Harry, who fenced with girls, who had never been in a fight in his life and was admittedly afraid of guns, thought he might make a general, if not a concert pianist. Intentionally or not, his position in the picture put him about as distant as possible from Bessie Wallace, who sat smiling at the far end of the second row. The night of graduation, it seemed half the town was packed into the high school auditorium. The girls were in white, the boys in dark suits and stiff collars. According to the Jackson Examiner, no finer-looking set had ever gathered on a single platform. Harry was not one of the student speakers. He received no awards or honors. The date was May 30th, 1901, Memorial Day, Decoration Day as it was more commonly called, and so there had been band music and flags flying since morning. Harry was 17.